Everyone, welcome to the Global Listening Center webcam series on listening. Let me mention a bit about the Global Listening Center. We like to think that the Global Listening Center is quite special, and it is a world-class organization devoted to advancing effective listening everywhere. I could tell you many outstanding things about it, like listing many of our distinguished scholars, scientists, and professionals, noting the great importance placed on ethics by the center, our worldwide network of over 30 countries, the special service members do throughout the world, including this year's year-long special activity named Joy of Giving Year, by which members do service for better listening in hospitals, agencies, schools, universities, and so on. I personally would summarize the Global Listening Center in three words: inclusion, interdisciplinary, and international. By inclusion, meaning the center is open to academicians and practitioners alike. Not many associations are so open. Interdisciplinary, social sciences, biological sciences, and physical sciences are represented among our membership. International, sure, members come from all over the world, but the center is keen on developing intercultural understanding. Well, for detailed information, please see our website, globallisteningcenter.org. Center spelled R-E-N-T-N, okay? So once again, that's globallisteningcenter.org. Now, as chair of the academic board, Global Listening Center, I have the great honor and privilege of introducing our presenter. Originally trained in electrical engineering, Alan Ehrlich, our presenter, spent much of his career in technology marketing management, while moderating a series of focus groups for a major New Jersey hospital. Mr. Ehrlich became interested in why senior management could not listen to the comments and complaints of patients and staff. A month later, he developed a program entitled Rational Listening to complaints, criticism, and mining informational goals. He has been teaching and presenting workshops on listening topics at colleges, corporations, law schools, and even elementary schools. For the past 12 years, he has focused his energy into researching and lecturing on listening disorders through his organization, the Center for Listening Disorders Research. He has written and lectured on this topic nationally throughout the United States. He's a member of the Global Listening Center's Executive Core Committee and chairs the Listening Disorders and Judicial Listening Divisions. A past president of the International Listening Association and the author of the chapter, Why Some People Can't Listen, in the textbook Listening Across Lives, published by Kendall Hunt, 2017. No more further ado, it's my great honor to turn over to our great and distinguished member, Alan. Alan?
Thank you so much, Ray. And I wish we could have seen your face rather than just your pocket as you spoke. But I understand speaking disorders as well as listening disorders. So we're doing fine. Thank you so much. Okay, we will get this ball rolling. I started teaching listening, well, almost, I guess almost 30 something years ago. And my basic pretense was that listening was the understanding of a verbal message within the words and context of the speaker's intended meaning. Working with executives, especially when they're dealing with complaints and criticism, I wanted them to understand what people were saying to them, not their own version of what people were saying to them. So it was important that the words and the context that the speaker intended was really defined in what I meant as listening. And then I learned that not everything is right. Okay, two people listening to a piano recital. The first one is relaxed, sitting there, taking it all in, allowing his creative mind to draw pictures that flowed with the music. The second person sits on the edge of his seat, listening and analyzing every note, the technical qualities of every note, its intensity, its technical accuracy, its artistic expression. The second listener was the instructor of the pianist, making sure that the concert, that she was actually doing what she was taught to do. Two people listening to the same thing, two totally different reasons and styles for listening. They listen very, very differently. A poem, a group of people sitting and listening to a poet speak beautiful words, rhymes or not rhymes, whatever the poem is. A group of people listening to the same words, and yet afterwards they sit down and discuss what they thought the meaning of the words were. Creatively, this is wonderful. For accuracy, you wonder, is this the meaning and intention that the speaker meant? Very different ways of listening. So listening is situational. It can empower the mind to wander, to paint pictures, to offer creative interpretations of what we hear. Yet, do we want that? You go into a restaurant and you order a Caesar salad, hold the croutons, please. I want the sirloin tips medium, rare, a baked potato dry. You don't want the waiter or the wait staff or the waiter to creatively interpret what you ordered, because you would be sending it back at expense to the restaurant and time expense to you. You want accuracy. You certainly want accuracy if you're listening to your financial advisor, or if you're listening to, or if your general physician is listening to a report by your radiologist describing what's in your mammogram. You don't want creative interpretation. You want accuracy. You want your students to accurately understand what you're saying if you're an instructor in front of the room. You don't want creative interpretation in everything. So what do? Listening is situational, but our brain is quite good at determining which situations require accuracy versus creativity. Now, thinking about that, with that in mind, there's an incredible amount of inaccurate, or what I call flawed listening going on. As a matter of fact, I adapted a quote by Dr. Manny Style. Flawed listening, I'm going to move some stuff around. I can't see my whole screen, sorry. Flawed listening is one of the most expensive human shortcomings in today's world. It reduces productivity, endangers relationships, exacerbates conflict. I've talked about that in mediation sessions, impedes finding solutions, and has an unaccountable cost in both real dollars and human lives. We can't have creativity, accuracy mixed up. We need to have them in their own boxes when it's time, because the cost is tremendous. The cost really is tremendous. In 2005, the Better Hearing Institute ran a survey of 40,000 families in the United States, and they discovered that hearing loss, now this hearing loss is just one of the many listening disorders, but hearing loss alone could cost a family up to $12,000 a year in annual income. $12,000 a year. Of all of the people with hearing loss in the US, they estimate it's $100 billion impact on the US economy annually. Now, this isn't on the total economy. This is on household economy. Just on the household economy. Of that, if it was a 15% tax bracket, you're talking about $15 billion that's not going to social services or whatever else is needed for the tax dollars. This report is 12 years old, okay? Numbers of hearing loss individuals has increased, as well as increase in salary, so that number is going to be low. Current estimates, I was asked a couple of years ago to estimate what the total impact of listening disorders. Now, this includes hearing loss, but also includes all the other ones we'll talk about today, on household income, on business losses, healthcare costs, and lost productivity. We'll look in the area of 8 to 10% of the gross world product. That amounts to almost $6 billion to $7.5 trillion annually. This is a huge loss. I mean, an absolutely huge loss. And yet, we don't understand what listening is. We don't really teach listening. So let's continue. Let's be truthful. We take listening for granted. We don't study it. We don't take it apart. We make a lot of assumptions about listening. The issue is we were all born listening. We were born as listeners. We were born listening. In the last 10 weeks of a child in utero, the fetus has a fully functioning auditory system that not only listens, takes notes of sound, remembers them, and can identify the speaker after the child is born. In utero, an infant, a fetus, can actually understand the mother's voice, and a week or two after birth, recognize the mother and make connection to that voice. We don't fully understand listening yet. Peter Farb wrote that children, no matter where they are in the globe, or live in any let me try again. Healthy children, no matter where in the globe they live, or the particular kind of language they speak, learn a native tongue. And they go through the same steps in acquiring their language at approximately the same speed, independent of whether they're deprived children or children brought up by doting parents who drill them in language. Same thing. Listening is built into our DNA. It's not something that we develop. Listening ability is so ubiquitous. We have difficulty understanding that people have difficulty listening, have difficulty in accurately understanding spoken messages. And the other thing is that listening is not homogeneous. Every one of us listens just a little bit differently, whether it be the frequency range, whether it be our attention span, whether it be our internal voice that is breaking in and changing things. We all listen differently, yet we all assume that we listen the same. I look at three assumptions. When we speak and the listener acknowledges in any way, shake of their head, nod of their head, maybe a verbal okay, that we understand that we've been heard, not only heard, but we've been heard and understood. If I turn that around, when we listen, obviously we understand exactly what's being said by the speaker. We know exactly what the speaker intended. Otherwise, we'd be constantly questioning, but we don't. We listen and we assume we understood. The third assumption is that listening is automatic. Let's take a look at these assumptions. Number one, we can't assume that understanding is assumed. We just can't do it. There are too many people with too many listening disorders, too many listening difficulties to assume that understanding is a given. A large number of people, no matter how much they want to try, can't easily understand spoken messages. It's impossible for them. And in a multicultural environment, as we'll talk about later, it becomes very, very difficult. The reasons could be physiological, neurological, psychological, social, cultural, or just the way the speaker speaks. It's the speaker's voice. There's a lot of issues that have to be taken into consideration that as a listener or a speaker in a communication situation, we don't take into account. Some of these reasons cannot be fixed. Some of them can be remediated through technology, instruction, and practice. And we have to understand the instruction part and the practice part as we move forward. I'm not sure we can touch on that in today's program. It's a whole program on its own, but we will get to that. We need to change our assumptions because listening is not automatic. It's a continuous loop of choices. Hearing is automatic. We can't stop hearing. We hear everything. But listening is a choice. What are we going to listen to? Are we going to listen to the person standing in front of us, to the siren that just went off on the road behind us, to the birds chirping in the trees, to the airplane above us, to the motorcycle that just passed by? What sound stream are we going to focus on and listen to? Are we going to listen more to our internal voice? Are we thinking? I know that over the last couple of days in putting together this presentation, you get into a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden something clicks in your head about, well, I should say this on one of these slides. And the person's voice, the external voice, is quieted. The internal voice takes over. We only have the ability to listen to one voice at a time. And the internal voice is the big elephant in the room. We can't get away from it. Also, which level of listening should we lock into in any particular situation? We'll talk about levels of listening in a little while as well. So hearing is automatic, listening is a choice, and we have to make that choice if we're going to listen. We can't assume. Give a little bit of history, just for me. I began my journey of discovery into the world of problematic listening. I was focused on a single listening disorder called hearing loss. I had a hearing loss. I was floored by it. I could hear people talk, but I had a great deal of difficulty understanding what they were saying. I would be standing in front of a class, and let me tell you, I was the best instructor in the world because I went over to the student's desk one-on-one and said, could you repeat what you said? I want to hear it fully. The fact was that I couldn't hear it standing in the front of the room. Or I could hear talk, but I couldn't understand the words. So my class thought it was great. I was coming right up to them. I was having this interaction with them. It was very selfish because I couldn't understand a word. So as an instructor and a coach, I wondered about how I could or would, or how anybody could or would help somebody listen better if they didn't understand all the parameters of difficulty that people with listening disorders have. We have courses in our communication studies programs of listening skills. We talk about active listening, and yet we don't take into any consideration why some people might not be able to listen, why some people might be having difficulty listening. And as I delved into this situation more and more, I got very involved. I ended up having to learn neuroscience and cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology. Thank goodness I've done a lot of work in audio engineering. That helped a lot. Acoustics, architecture, the physics of sound, the mathematical correlation between distance and sounds. I had to learn a little bit about linguistics because they all come under the heading, they all interplay in what we call listening disorders. So I sat down and began to chart out all the listening disorders that I could figure out. If you try to read this, sorry about the eye chart here. I will try to get copies of this to anybody that wants it. But what it ended up doing was categorizing listening disorders into 4 categories: psychological, physical, neurological and cognitive, and a catch-all external, because there's a lot of issues that occur external to ourselves that affect our ability to listen. The engineer in me said, how does this all fit together? So I started to develop a flow chart of what listening is about. I haven't found anything in any of the literature where anybody tried to put together all of the processes and how they fit together so that we could begin to understand listening. This chart looks at 2 levels of listening. We'll talk about that more. It's a dense chart, and interestingly enough, there was a writer from the Wall Street Journal a number of years ago who laughingly described this chart as a flowchart that looks more like a schema for a nuclear submarine than it does for anything that goes on in our head. And the more people that see it, the more people agree with that writer. It is dense, and I understand it, and maybe we'll do an hour webinar just on the flowchart. So let's begin where we all began, and that's as an infant, because we all started there. And the primary job of an infant, of a very young infant, in the first 12 to 18 months of their life, they only have really one job, and that job is to learn language. And that job is to learn language, learn their native tongue, in order to be able to socialize with the world around them. Listening is the key to that. Listening is the only communication skill that we're born with, and we use listening to learn how to read, how to write, and how to talk. Not necessarily in that order, but okay. So we learn how to talk, we learn how to read, and we learn how to write. All based upon our listening skills that we were born with, that we did not learn anywhere else. Listening as an infant reduces the structure of this chart dramatically. There's this whole section in here that doesn't exist for an infant, because an infant has to develop a lot of the processes. They have to grow into a lot of the processes. And remember that the infant's job is to learn language. So sound comes in, they hear it, they localize it, they attune to it, they have to deconstruct it, because we don't speak in individual words, we speak in flows, we speak in sentences. The words flow together. So we have to deconstruct it, we have to reconstruct it, we have to recognize the phonological code that makes up our words. We have to see whether it's in our object concept database. We put a grammatical context to it. We see if there's a definition. If there's no definition, we have to create a definition. The mind does not allow us to have blanks. If we hear something, we have to match that in our mind. Two things that allow us to do that, we'll talk about in a minute. One is prediction. The second part of prediction is called auditory closure. Excuse me for just a second. So these areas here are inborn. The grammatical context. An infant has an incredible ability to put things into a grammatical context. We know that they are developing this object concept database because we can show them a ball, and when they're old enough to understand a little bit, after a couple of months, if we say ball, their eyes will go to it, and if they're old enough to crawl, they might crawl to it. So the object concept database begins to take effect. Around the age of 2 or 3, there's some obvious changes in the child's listening. And those changes are interesting because they are accompanied by a couple of things. One, that the child doesn't have to listen quite as carefully. They're not as intent on listening as they were a couple months before. Hard to visualize if you're only looking at a child for a little bit here, a little bit there. Your grandchild comes to visit once every 2 or 3 weeks. But if you really watch a child develop over a period of time, there is a marked difference somewhere between the age of 2 or 3. And that's because this whole level in here begins to develop. They don't have to listen quite as carefully because they can predict what is coming next, the words that are coming next. They can put it into context. The Umwelt we'll talk about in a second, but they begin to build their contextual library so that they don't have to work quite as hard at listening. From the age of birth to about 18 months, they are listening at an extremely intense level, so intense that they are burning up cognitive energy at an incredible rate. You'll notice that an infant sleeps 2, 3, 4 times a day. They'll take naps, short naps. But that nap reinvigorates and replaces some of the cognitive energy that is lost. When we lose a lot of cognitive energy, we get tired. And I bet to anybody on our call today, if I placed you in an advanced neuroscience course for one session, 1, 2 or 3 hour session, and told you that you were going to be tested on the content of that class at the end, you would have to concentrate very hard using language of neuroscience that you might not be familiar with. You're going to have to really concentrate. Your prediction engine won't work. Your contextual library won't work. You're going to have to constantly create new meanings of words that you haven't heard. At the end of that 3 hours, you're going to want to take a nap, just like the infant did at the end of their time that they listened intently. It's amazing. I remember when I was learning to fly, listening to the radio, listening to my instructor, knowing that if I made a mistake, we could crash. The tension, the ability to listen, the intensity of listening. 1 hour lesson, I went home and napped for 2 hours It was really amazing. So where do we go? Okay. So the prediction engine really begins to kick in. And this is something that is developed throughout our entire life. It begins at about the age of 2 or 3 and continues on forever. We are constantly building our ability to predict. For an example, we all work in specific industries, and we talk in acronyms. And those acronyms are very implicit to that industry. If we're talking to somebody outside of that industry and use that acronym, they won't know what we mean. But we can predict the meaning of that acronym if we're talking to somebody within our industry. It's contextual. So we learn to predict, and at the very worst case of listening, we predict what the speaker is going to say. We've already concluded, they might have just started, but we've concluded what they are going to say, and we spend the rest of the time building our defense or our response. We've already concluded, we've predicted what they're going to say. Child won't do that because they don't have that ability. But as we grow older, we do, and that's a major flaw in listening. So prediction is actually taught when you learn a second language. So just to say what's here, depending upon the context, a news report, a university lecture, an exchange in a supermarket, we can predict the words and the style of language the speaker will use. Our knowledge of the world helps us to anticipate the kind of information we're likely to hear. The key word there, and this comes from the British Council, the key word is likely to hear. So we predict, and if the speaker doesn't match our prediction, we are absolutely liable to miss it because we predicted it. We've gone beyond the speaker at this point. Dangerous and flaw. It really creates misunderstanding and tremendous difficulty, especially if it's an important conversation. So the second thing that a child develops is what I call the Umwelt. The Umwelt is our personal perceptual world. It includes our beliefs, our emotions, our assumptions, our values, our memories, our prejudices, our expectations. All of this is built in. The Umwelt also creates all the filters that we use as we grow older. All of the issues that we have. Madeline Burley Brown, in her book, Listening: The Forgotten Skills, has this wonderful chart. She doesn't call it an Umwelt, she just calls it our filters. But we run what we hear through our Umwelt, through this set of filters. Does it match our beliefs? Does it match our past experience? Does it meet with our assumptions? How is it with our values and our interests? And you can take a look at the politics today in any country, and I'm not going to be political about this, but anything that is said is run through a belief system, a value system, our prejudices, and either discounted immediately or taken as truth without any validation that it is true. We use the Umwelt, we use this set of filters, the set of experiences, the set of memories to classify what we hear as, no, I'm not going to believe that, toss it away, or it is total fact. Of course, there's a middle ground where we actually begin to analyze and work at it. But in today's world, there's so much that the Umwelt actually blocks. And it's almost to the point of being scary because dialogue almost doesn't exist. We can't even talk to one another reasonably because if it doesn't match our beliefs, it doesn't match our values, or goes against our prejudices, it's discounted. Not good. I take a look and I've identified 3 levels of listening. Level 0 is subconscious and reactive. Talk about that in a minute because it's a very important level of listening when it comes to auditory attention. Level 1 is unconscious, intuitive, effortless, and grounded in the topics and vocabulary and sounds that we use, and it relies on our ability to predict. It is effortless. This is what adults listen, the level that we adults listen at, probably 90 to 95% of the time. It's easy. It doesn't require an awful lot of cognitive energy. It doesn't require a lot of deep thought. If you're at a bar and you're talking to somebody sitting next to you, you could be talking about your vacation. You could be talking about what's going on at work. It's effortless. But now you get into a conversation with your boss who wants you to do something very specific and has a list of tasks and a list of things that needs to be done. You have to go to level 2 listening, which is a conscious activity, which requires a choice on your part to move to this level. It requires mental activity. It requires generating meanings for new words. It requires deep memory. You've got to be able to, okay, I remember that. Pull it out of your memory, place it into the context of what is being spoken that particular minute. It might require complex calculations. And the idea of remembering things, can you imagine if you are being interrogated by an attorney or by the police, and you're at level 1 listening unconsciously, it's effortlessly, you respond, you don't really put it into your memory how you responded because level 1 listening just doesn't require that. They come back and ask the same question in a different way and you answer it differently. All of a sudden you're a suspect. All of a sudden you're almost pleading guilt because you're changing the way you respond. That type of inquiry requires level 2 listening. It requires that conscious activity. We have to be able to isolate these. So let's go back because now we want to get into what could go wrong. Okay, so hearing is about sound. Hearing does not have anything to do with understanding. Let's take a look at what's on the frequency spectrum. We hear from about 200 or so cycles per second, 200 hertz, up to around 8,000 hertz. We hear actually up to around 20,000 hertz, but the main thing is that we hear is between 200 and 8,000 hertz. So a dog barking is at about 70 decibels. Our talking, our normal conversation is between 30 and 50, depending upon how animated it is. If you could hear the leaves rustling, that's between 10 and 20 decibels. It's pretty soft. Birds chirping, whispering, 20 decibels, very, very soft. Why does this matter? Because if we put some of the things in our ear, every one of these sounds comes into our ear. Every one. If we're walking on the street talking to somebody, we hear the conversation, we hear the cars, we hear the birds, we hear the trees rustling, we hear the tires, we hear the pistons in the car. I mean, the amount of noise signatures out there is incredible. Our ears have no filters. So everything, every sound around gets filtered, gets driven right into our ears. This matters because look at where some of our consonants, our sounds of voice, the sounds that make up our words are. F, S, T, H sounds are very low. They're almost at a whisper. Vowel sounds, U and E, and A is actually up here as well. They're much more powerful. We'll see why this matters a lot in just a couple seconds. Okay, so hearing. Simple process. 2 small membranes, 3 small bones, a few fluids, a bunch of hairs, 15,500 little hairs that look like cowlicks. If you look at it over here, just like a cowlick. Pretty simple system. 2 membranes, 3 bones, some fluids. All of this takes all of the sound that comes through our ears, converts it first from sound energy to mechanical vibrations in the middle ear. Then it converts it to fluid dynamics and fluid flow in the cochlea. The fluid then runs over the hairs, the cilia, and that converts it to neuroelectrical impulses, which go to our brain. Pretty simple system. If it's that simple, what can go wrong? You know, some things at any rate. Hearing loss. For those of you on a phone or without visuals, I'm showing a comic of an elderly couple sitting there with a fish tank, and it says, "What's that you say? My hearing's impaired? He looks perfectly healthy to me, but maybe you ought to have your eyes examined." That's a goldfish. Hearing is difficult. And for a very long time, hearing loss and aging were a tightly coupled pair. But not so anymore. 2012, Johns Hopkins University estimated that 1/5 of all Americans 12 years old and older have a hearing loss so severe that it might make communication difficult. 5% of teenagers, 8.5% of those in the 20s, 17% in their 30s, 11.5% of school-aged children have a temporary or permanent hearing loss on any one particular day. Got a class of 30 students, 3 or 4 of them are having difficulty hearing you on any day. Hearing loss can be very sudden, usually from a loud explosive noise. Huge percentage, 18%, almost 60% of those coming home from a war zone have a hearing loss or tinnitus, have a hearing problem. One thing that we don't think about is because our airbags in our cars are safety mechanisms. They're there to protect us in the case of an accident. Yet when those airbags go off, 18% of the people in motor vehicle accidents where the airbags have deployed suffer from an immediate loss of hearing. I worked with one woman who had an 85 decibel loss of hearing after an automobile accident. After a year and a half, it was up to around 35, 40%. It came back a little bit. But what we don't think about is that there's a shotgun shell, a munition, an explosive behind each one of those airbags. And when those go off, it's a very loud, about 130 decibel impulse sound that can destroy our hearing instantaneously. But for most people, hearing loss is slow. It could take a decade. It could take 10 years before somebody actually admits to themselves that they have a hearing loss. We turn up the volume a little bit. We sit in the front of the room. We fill in using our prediction engine. We can deny the underlying problem of hearing loss for almost a decade. I, for one, almost a decade. It took me that long. I kind of thought I had a hearing loss, but gee, I could hear people, so it couldn't be that bad. Just kept going and going until the point where I couldn't keep going anymore. Okay? This might seem a little familiar.
Yeah. Okay, well, I had this idea for a pizza place where you make your own pie.
Right.
You remember that?
Yeah, well, that was a good one. Wow.
What's that?
Excuse me? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seinfeld used the soft speaker, somebody that spoke very softly, so that people with normal hearing, we assume, couldn't hear. But think of the same thing with somebody speaking at a normal voice, and you're constantly leaning in to try to hear better. Young child in a classroom trying to move to a front seat because they can't hear any better, and the teacher says, "You're disrupting the class, go to the back." It's a problem. We don't understand. How to be young again. Hearing loss is not just for the elderly. It affects the young, and it affects them with devastating consequences. 5 million school-aged children in the USA exhibit some degree of hearing impairment. Minimal sensory hearing loss affects 5.5%, 2.5 million children. That's 1 out of every 20 students. And we have no idea the amount of adults because we don't test adults in the same way. In the words of one famous, or now famous, Kansas farmer, you don't notice a thing until you don't notice a thing. Two types of hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss caused by something that blocks the sound energy from getting to the to the inner ear. It could be kids playing. They put a bean in their ear. They put a piece of popcorn in their ear. I've had to remove that a couple times. It's a hearing loss. A thickening of the mucus in the middle ear for a child that has an ear infection causes a hearing loss. And by the way, that's very painful. So you give the child antibiotics, the pain goes away, but the hearing loss is there for at least another 2 weeks. 2 weeks. We don't think about it. We just don't think about it. We think about the pain. We don't think about the child's inability to effectively hear. The second type of hearing loss is sensory neural hearing loss. It's the loss of function of some of those cilia, the hairs of the inner ear, or possibly a dysfunction of the nerves. Sensory neural hearing loss accounts for 90%, actually more than 90% of all cases of hearing loss. So that's the one we're going to think about. It can be caused by aging, disease, such as the mumps, meningitis, multiple sclerosis. The one thing we again don't think about is that it can be also caused by taking drugs. And I don't mean illegal drugs, I mean prescription drugs or over-the-counter drugs. A lot of medications are ototoxic. They destroy our hearing system. In particular, aspirin. Aspirin is an ototoxic drug. Take too much of it, and it can ruin your hearing. Cisplate, quinine, streptomycin, gentamicin, all of these drugs will affect your hearing if you take them an extended period of time. Very, very dangerous. And for somebody with an existing hearing loss, taking these drugs will only exacerbate the loss. The biggest issue for sensory neural hearing loss is exposure to noise. We're going to talk about that. Conductive hearing loss can generally be reversed. You remove the bean from the ear, a piece of popcorn from the ear. You give some medication for the ear infection. No more conductive hearing loss. It's gone. You can have sclerosis of the interior bones that can be repaired by laser surgery. Conductive hearing loss can be reversed in 98% of the cases. Sensory neural hearing loss is permanent. And the only way to treat it is with hearing aids or some amplification device. What are the symptoms? Muffled, marbled, garbled hearing, difficulty understanding what people are saying, very, very difficult if there's a lot of background noise. You go to a restaurant, it's near impossible to hold a conversation. You're sitting with somebody, they're constantly turning up the volume. For somebody with normal hearing, they're turning down the volume because it's unbearable for them. People with hearing loss withdraw socially. This is both youth and aged. They withdraw because they're embarrassed. They might answer questions improperly. You ask them a question, they give an answer to a question you didn't ask because they heard something different, because they predicted something different. They didn't hear what you had to say. Depression, incredible. Hearing loss causes depression, and then depression causes a listening disorder. It's a big circle. But hearing loss isn't just about volume. You could turn the volume up all you want. Hearing loss is about the parts of speech that go missing. They're gone. Because it's ironic that the sounds we need most for speech recognition, for word recognition, are the first sounds to disappear when you have a hearing loss. The high frequencies and the softest volumes, which is the consonant sounds, and they're the first ones to go. The TH, the S, the SH, the F sounds, gone. The PB, they're the next to go. VZ, M, and N, they disappear with a hearing loss, or they get kind of blended together where you can't tell whether it's a TH, an S, an SH, or an F. They're blended together. So what do? You reach back into your prediction and try to figure out what is being said. I will be sharing the slides with you afterwards. This is being videoed. The video will be available, and I will be able to share the slides. We took a look at this before, okay, where the vowels are much louder because the vowels carry the power of a conversation. The consonants provide the meaning of the words that we're going to speak. So if we took a very simple sentence and say things with feelings, very simple sentence, and if we removed all the consonants, that's what we'd have. You couldn't figure that out. What'd they say? I-E, oh. No, absolutely no intelligence in that. But if we took the same sentence and we removed all the vowels, well, you can almost make that out. Say things with feelings. The consonants carry the meaning, the vowels carry the power. With a hearing loss, as you'll see, we hear the vowels and the consonants get lost. So this is an audiogram. If anybody's not familiar with it, this is what an audiologist would use to plot out your hearing loss. They would put earphones on you, put you in a quiet room, and put a tone into one ear at a time. A tone, they would start off with a very soft tone at, let's say, 0 decibels, which is the baseline of hearing. If you didn't hear it, they'd increase it to 10 dB, to 20 dB, to 30 dB. They keep making it louder until you said, I heard that. And they'd mark it on the chart. And they'd go to another frequency and do the same thing. Maybe they'd start loud and keep reducing it until you said you didn't hear it. And they plot out what your hearing loss would be. So here's a person with a severe hearing loss at high frequencies. They've got about a 35 decibel loss in the low frequencies, and it gradually goes down to about 70 decibel loss at the very high frequencies. Let's take a look at something. Here's where our sounds, our voice sounds, the sounds that, the phonemes that make up our words lie on that audiogram. The TH, very soft, 20 decibels at about 7,000 cycles, 7,000 hertz. The F sound, about 4,500 hertz at about 30 decibels, S, H. The vowels, much higher in volume, 40, 45 decibels for an A, and E is over 50, a U is almost 60. Now I want you just to try for just 1 second. All the mics are off, so nobody's going to hear you. You can do this in private. Make a loud E sound. So if you sounded the word E, you can make that pretty powerful. And covering your computer screen, try making a TH sound that's loud. It gets messy, so cover your screen. Because you can't do it. You can't make a loud TH sound. It's impossible. So if somebody with a hearing loss, and you say, well, I will just talk louder, you will increase the volume of the vowels, but the volume of your consonants won't grow very much at all. So it's almost worthless. So let's put it all together. This happens to be my hearing loss. This is what my audiogram would look like. So we're down at 65 decibels at, 2,000 hertz. It gets a little better at the higher frequencies, a little better at the lower frequencies. So I've got a notch in here where my hearing is gone. So anything under this, I can hear fine. Anything above this, I can't hear very well. So a TH sound is what? 10, 12, almost 20 decibels softer than what I can hear. The G sound is almost 25, 30 decibels softer than I can hear. Makes listening very difficult. Again, I can hear people talking because I can hear sounds of these letters, of these phonemes. But the ones that make the words really words, I'm gone. They don't help. Okay? So I've got about a 32 decibel loss between the K sound and what I can hear, and yet the U sound is 20 decibels higher than my normal hearing. The difference, which is almost 55 decibels, is a big difference to try to discern the consonant sounds from some of the vowel sounds. Makes hearing and makes understanding pretty difficult. Let's take a look at it in a different way. This is a voice print. I use a harmonic voice print analyzer to tell me what the voice is. So what we have is frequency going up on the y-axis, time across the x-axis, and the intensity of color is the volume of what's being spoken. So if I said the say things with feelings, this is what it would look like. You have the S up here. You have the S for things up here. The TH, you'll notice, is here. The S in feelings is here. The F in feelings is here. Now take a look at what it would look like if you had a moderate hearing loss of about 30, 35 decibels. The S is gone. The S is gone here. The TH is gone. TH is gone here. What you're left with is some of the intensity of the vowels. Almost all of the defining phonemes that make up the word are gone. So in talking to somebody, you have to fill in the blanks. It's not easy. It's very cognitively depleting. It uses a lot of cognitive energy, And trying to listen to somebody with a hearing loss, as somebody with a hearing loss, listening to somebody can be very draining. So if people with a hearing loss are having difficulty, we as listening professionals and listening practitioners need to be able to understand this. And have you seen any of this in any of your listening courses? I don't think so. This is the issue. Let's take a look at something else. This is a little bit longer. This is a professional speaker with incredibly good diction reading the first couple lines of Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Bells. I'm going to play it with full fidelity so you hear what it sounds like.
Hear the sleighs with their bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night, while the stars that oversprinkle all the heavens seem to twinkle with a crystalline delight.
Did you notice the enunciation of the S's at the ends of the words? Okay, he was very, very careful about enunciating the S's. Somebody with a moderate hearing loss, 30 decibels at 2,000, 3,000, 40 decibels at 4,000 hertz. If you had this hearing loss and heard the same speaker saying the same words.
Hear the sleighs with their bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night, while the stars that oversprinkle all the heavens seem to twinkle with a crystalline delight.
You notice that you're able to hear some of the introductory S sounds. I didn't see any, so I saw a couple people lean forward because they had to get closer to their speaker. It's what you do when you've got a hearing loss. This is simulating moderate hearing loss for you. The end S's, which represent plurals and possessives, disappeared. I wouldn't want to think about that if I was a salesperson or customer service, because those plural and possessive S's are very, very important. Notice they pretty much disappeared. They're gone. So somebody with an untreated, meaning hearing aids, untreated hearing loss will hear far less and get far more information from what is being said than somebody who has normal hearing. If you lose enough of your hearing, you end up with 3 consonant groupings. These all blend together. Here, here, and here. So hearing loss is not a hearing problem. Hearing loss is an understanding problem. It's just sometimes no matter how hard you try, you just can't get the words right. For those who are on the phone or don't have visuals, it's a comic of, I guess, it's not Star Wars, forgot, sorry. Says, bring me aboard, Scotty. And the next pane is that they're sitting on a board like a seesaw. Aboard, Scotty, aboard. Same word, 2 different meanings, or 2 words if it's split it apart, a board versus a board. Sometimes we just can't get the meanings right. And because we have difficulty understanding, hearing loss is very well hidden. We don't wear them. It's not a scar on us. We don't have a rash on our face. We don't have any markings on our head that says we have a hearing loss. We don't wear a jacket that says I've got a hearing loss. If a blind person has the white cane with the red tip, we know that that person is blind, but there's no indication for somebody with a hearing loss. So we assume that people can hear. So if they don't get what we say correctly, or if their attention isn't focused, well, we put it on a blame of, well, they've got attention deficit, they've got a behavioral problem, they've got no motivation. We think about all the reasons in the world that they are not understanding what we're saying, except for listening disorders. We do not consider listening disorders in our thinking. Hearing loss is just one of many listening disorders. It's one of the most prevalent, but it's not the only one. As I said at the beginning, it was easy to I'm going to focus on hearing loss, I'm going to learn about it, I'm going to begin to work it into my listening programs. And then the world exploded into so many other things. Tinnitus, for example, it's a roaring, clicking, hissing noise. It could be soft, it could be incredibly loud, it could be intermittent, or it could be constant. But there's no doubt, if you've got tinnitus, it interferes with your activities, it interferes with your work, it interferes with your sleep. It is devastating. I think Dick Haley is on our call. As I recall, at one point we were talking about tinnitus, and he said that tinnitus, I believe it was his wife, Carol, had tinnitus, and she constantly heard an F-sharp note. All through the day, music, one note, F-sharp, was playing. Very, very annoying. Tinnitus is currently the #1 service-connected disability of all veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. 20% of Americans have tinnitus. 90% of people coming back from the war zones have either tinnitus or hearing loss or both. And the cost of tinnitus treatment, not good. Quiet them down. Okay. The cost is in excess of $2.5 billion a year. This is 2014. We've had 2.5 years of war since then. This number is quite a bit more. Auditory attention. Are you easily distracted? Don't drive. Okay. Auditory attention is one of the areas that I find to be incredibly important in the study of listening disorders, and yet it is totally unstudied. Excuse me for half a second. Susie, sorry about that. Dogs don't listen all the time. Okay. I consider auditory attention to be critical in how we look at listening disorders and listening loss, because I look at auditory attention in two separate levels. There's first reflective level. If we hear a loud noise, if we hear somebody talking, instinctively we either jump if it's a very loud, explosive type of noise or a siren. We turn our head in that direction. We localize it, we identify it, and we then figure out an elective level. Do we want to return and listen to that particular sound stream? Is it the person sitting in front of us? Is it a siren that we want to follow because it's coming at us? Do we want to listen to a different sound stream? The siren went off, okay, now I want to listen to the dog barking next door. Or do we go internal? Well, the siren went off. Now I'll start to think, is it my house? Is it somebody I know? Is it an ambulance? Is it a fire? What's going on? Take it internally. Or we could choose an entirely different sound stream and move forward, because listening itself is a choice. We have a choice of any of the sound streams that are coming into our ears, we can apply our attention to. A loud noise, we're going to reflect We're going to jump, we're going to turn our heads, we'll localize, we'll identify, and then we have a choice. I'd love to see far more research into auditory attention. I will tell you that I've searched the journals and I don't find an awful lot. The journals tend to look at it as attention and attention deficit, which is a much broader issue than auditory attention. So sound messages are carried from the, why this is important. The sound messages carried from the cochlea to the mid-pons area of the brainstem. The brainstem itself is the reflective part of our brain. It's the animal instinct. We don't do a lot of processing in our brainstem. The brainstem it detects sound, it triggers it, and it moves sounds forward. It's the problem of having a home office, so I apologize for the noises here. It's very interesting. I'm going to go back a slide. It's very interesting because we have to be able to, the brainstem triggers what we do in terms of survival. Hearing is a survival instinct. If you notice, we can't turn off our hearing. We can shut our eyes. We can't shut our ears. We can determine what we want to listen to, or we could listen to nothing at all. Okay? But we are always hearing. And the reflective part of our auditory attention will capture any sound that our brain feels is important at the time and interrupt whatever we're listening to. If you're walking in a mall, a shopping mall, crowded, people talking, music coming from the stores, and somebody across the mall calls your name, you'll automatically, reflexively turn and look in that direction. If somebody drops some change on the floor, you'll instantly turn and look because it's normal. It's a sound that breaks the pattern, and it's part of our survival instinct, which is based in our brainstem. So let's look at auditory language processing disorders, which our auditory attention is part of. So it's a neurological defect that affects how the brain processes spoken language. It makes it very difficult for the individual to process verbal instructions or to even filter out background noises, because there's a breakdown in receiving and memory, auditory information. Hearing could be absolutely perfect. You put the person into an audiologist, they will get total zeros right across, perfect hearing. But they can't understand what's being said because there's a breakdown at the brain level, at the cognitive level, at the neurological level, on what's coming in versus what can be understood. So a child with auditory processing disorder may have the same type of reaction of behavioral issues that a child with ADD, ADHD has. The problem is that it's very easy for somebody to point at the child and say, you've got ADD or ADHD. Auditory processing issues requires specialized examination, not only hearing, but psychological and neurological tests as well. So quite often what will happen is, okay, child has ADD, and I'm going to put that child on medication for ADD. We'll see. This is a matching of a child with minimal or mild hearing loss or auditory processing disorder versus a child with attention deficit disorder. Notice the similarities? I don't want to read the list, it'll be boring. Poor self-concept, they're isolated, low self-esteem. Doesn't seem to listen, can't sit still and listen. Compulsive, acts on the spur of the moment. It's almost like one is the definition of the other. A child with hearing loss or auditory processing disorders is almost identical in terms of the presentation as it is to somebody with with ADD and they're immediately put onto medication. And essentially, if the medication works, then the doctor says, okay, we've taken care of the ADD. If the medication doesn't work, they give it a year before they take the child off of medication. That means a child is on essentially amphetamines for a year before they're truly diagnosed with auditory processing or hearing loss. It's estimated that 7% of the children have APD. The number of adults is pretty much unknown. It's kind of guessed at 10%. So how many people are on medications that they don't need? Kind of worrisome, okay? We talk about children, and most of us at the university level, certainly at the legal level, at the mediation level, we're not dealing with children, we're dealing with adults. But the act of listening changes, again, as we move from childhood to adult, not only in the fact that we develop prediction and Umwelt, but children are expected to be active listeners. They're expected to answer questions in more detail than as adults. As adults in meetings, we can usually get away with nodding our head or saying yes. We would expect more from a child than we do from an adult. So an adult who isn't processing the sounds as well as they could, an auditory processing disorder, a hearing loss, can get away with it for a much longer time than a child. But the child most often will be put on ADD, ADHD, amphetamine medications as opposed to truly figuring out what's going on. So a child, they might complain of difficulty hearing or understanding at the college level. So college university professors take heed. Learning, understanding lectures, they'll have difficulty because it's a large room. And if we think about the physics of sound, the further away you are, the more reduced the sound levels are. The square of the distance. Very difficult. You're having a problem, sit in the back. As opposed to you're having a problem, sit up front so you could hear me better. They have, difficulty taking notes. They're better off if they borrow notes from a friend because their notes might be inaccurate. They demonstrate significant scatter in academic achievement. They'll have poorer grades that rely on listening and better grades that rely on reading because verbal presentation is more difficult for them to understand than the ability to read. Notice reading and listening use the same internal voice, but listening you only have one shot at. It's a passing thing. You can only listen to the same thing once. Reading, you can review that paragraph as many times as you need to for understanding. So they may report that homework takes them far more time to complete. They have a history of subtle difficulty in reading, spelling, comprehension, because their listening ability isn't very good. They have difficulty completing tests within a time frame, but they'll do okay if the test is untimed. Auditory processing disorders really create a problem. And the interesting part is they can start at any time. They can start when the level of listening becomes too much for the brain to handle. So a child that might have done very well in elementary school and middle school, when they get to high school or college, might all of a sudden have a sudden breakdown in their ability to understand. And they won't be able to really comprehend what this breakdown is because it occurs pretty suddenly. It occurs at a time of life when you think you're doing well, that everything is going okay. I did great in elementary school, and yet I can't accomplish anything here in college. Why? Goes back to the problem of a possible auditory processing disorder. It might be too much partying, but it also might be auditory processing problems. It's kind of difficult to understand what somebody with an auditory processing disorder goes through, what it might sound like. Let's take a look. A number of years ago on a TV program called Good Morning America, an author, Lois Cam Hyben, wrote a book called The Sound of Hope. And if you haven't read it and you're interested in auditory processing disorders, it's a must read. Rosie O'Donnell, the actress, has a son with auditory processing disorders. And after the book came out, they were interviewed on this TV program, Good Morning America. And what they tried to explain was what it was like for somebody, for this child with an auditory processing disorder, to hear something like a poem, Little Red Riding Hood.
Ladle Rat Rotten Hut. Once upon term, there worsted ladle gull who lived whether murder in her ladle cottage on her itch of her lodge dock florist. Disk ladle gull orphan worry ladle cluck whether putty ladle rat hut, and for disk raisin, Pimple called her Ladle Rat Rotten Hut.
Can you imagine now taking a test on the poem Little Red Riding Hood? Nothing's correct. The words are mixed. Phonetics are there to some degree, but totally turned around. Somebody with an auditory processing disorder, relatively severe, this is what they'd be hearing. We take listening for granted. We talk to somebody, we assume that they've understood what we've said. All it takes is a nod of their head for us to say to ourselves, I understand. They understood what I said. They didn't understand what was being said. So the symptoms of auditory processing disorders: additional processing time, frequently failed to respond to someone's comments, provides an off-the-wall response, an answer to a question that wasn't asked. They understood the words that are heard, but mix them up, get them all mixed up, get easily frustrated because they are not understanding, and they act out because of this frustration. They rely on pictures, illustrations, gestures, visual information so they can process what's going on. They avoid social communication because they fear coming up with the wrong answer and somebody is going to bully them or make fun of them. Complex language such as metaphors, you little piggies, baffle them because they can't put anything within the context. The distraction in attention becomes constant problem for the schools, and they're quite often put into classes of students that have great difficulty rather than trying to work with them and understand what auditory processing disorders they have and how they can be taken care of. Why? Could happen because of birth defects, developmental delays, strokes, Alzheimer's. As I said, it's not just for children. Traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, a lot of reasons why auditory processing disorders occur. We get back to the Umwelt. Okay, we get back to those filters because the filters are critical because we don't understand. Madeline Durley Brown, again in her book, talks about how how we don't understand how our childhood experiences influence our adult behavior. We don't understand how the influence of our belief system changes what we hear to what we want to believe. We've heard the term selective hearing. Selective hearing is we hear what we want to hear because the Umwelt, the filters in our Umwelt, have blocked out what we don't want to hear. Very serious, and it's very serious in the world situation now. It makes solving conflict very, very difficult. It makes it near impossible to solve a conflict that people aren't talking because people don't hear what each other says. Self-absorption. depression, narcissism, okay? One of the greatest listening disorders is self-absorption, whether it be caused by narcissism, depression, worry, stress, because we've turned ourselves inside out, and the only thing we listen to is this cycle of sound that's being created by our self-talk, rehearsed, going back into the loop with our thoughts, come back to the self-talk. This loop here becomes all-encompassing, and we don't allow outside voice in. A very depressed person in a clinical depression will have absolutely very little understanding of what's being said to them. Matter of fact, quite often they will sit in a huddled up structure and not even respond to the speaker. Okay, depression, bad thing. But even a slight depression triggers this, and understand that it is a listening disorder. Speech understandability, another one of the external issues that we have to deal with when it comes to understanding or effective listening. Two dogs barking, and eventually they say, well, if you'd said that in the first place, we could have settled this hours ago. Okay? I've tried to plot out speech understandability attributes. It's another one of my eye charts, I apologize. There's about 105 different attributes on this of things that can create dissonance between the speaker and the listener. And this is something that the listener doesn't have control over. The listener cannot control the enunciation of the speaker, or the speaking style, or the interpersonal relationship, or the cultural differences in what they say and how they speak, or the vocal delivery, and the nonverbals. All of this is outside of what the listener can control, yet it is critical for effective communication. So when we teach speaking skills, we teach presentation skills, we need to look at a chart like this and take it from the listener's perspective. What's your speaking style in relation to what the listener is used to hearing? Is there a dialect? Is there an accent? And let me tell you, with accents and dialects, for somebody with a hearing loss, it's very, very difficult. It takes a huge amount of extra energy and extra time for a person with a hearing loss to comprehend the word structure of somebody with a very heavy accent. The time is critical because the processing time in that phonological loop, we might be processing the word, trying to see whether it matches something in our contextual database or not. But in the meantime, 5 other words have been said. We're now 5 words behind schedule. And it can be very difficult to catch up. Very, very difficult for somebody with a hearing loss, let alone auditory processing disorders, to deal on a one-to-one with strong accents, heavy dialects, or things that don't meet your current expectations. You go into a meeting and you expect to hear certain things, and all of a sudden, it's very different. You go into the meeting expecting to be talking about your next assignment, and the first thing that is being spoken about is how you're going to be laid off. It's dissonance. Doesn't connect. You have to readjust your expectations. Again, time is involved, and understanding may be lost. So to break this down into a little bit easier, get away from that 105, speech understandability attributes, we talk about language, dialect, accent, enunciation, cultural differences, vocal delivery, Neurophysical issues, speaking style, interpersonal communication. How close are we? Then that's a cultural issue as well. What the nonverbals are. Is there a gender or sexual orientation to what's being said that might throw things off? Okay. Penny Ure wrote a book called Teaching Listening Comprehension, and I found this very interesting because she talked about a person in her class who was teaching English as a second language and talked about a native French speaker who was having a lot of trouble with words that began with the TH sound until she realized that in the French language, the TH sound doesn't exist. So therefore, the French-speaking listener had to convert that to something that was more native to his language, which was an F or an S. And sometimes the words made no sense because where TH got substituted for an S and changed the word. We've got to be very careful and we've got to be aware of listening disorders. Let's take a very quick listening. A Kurdish speaker speaking a sentence.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
Okay. Typical sentence.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick snacks of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
2 very same sentence. But as a listener, especially if you were listening as English as a second language, they could very easily have 2 totally different meanings, although the words were exactly the same, because the pronunciation was so different. We had the same issue in the United States. If we take somebody that might have come from Massachusetts,
Please
the
call
Boston
Stella.
area.
Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
Typically a Boston type of accent and typical of the East Coast, spoken very quickly. You go to Mississippi.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
Notice just the time difference between 2 people speaking the same sentence. Makes listening all the more interesting to study. Some communication tips and tricks, because I wouldn't want to leave you with all negatives. Okay, if you're a speaker, get the listener's attention before speaking. Speak clearly, slowly, and naturally. Avoid covering your mouth. Don't talk from far away. I love when somebody tries to talk from 2 rooms away and I don't have my hearing aids in. Nothing, can't hear a word. Face your partner, let them see your mouth move. Keep your messages simple and concise. Tell your partner about topic changes. If you're going to make changes, ask questions to ensure that your partner understands. And rephrase your message if your partner didn't understand. Use body language. If you are the listener, tell others that you have a hearing loss or any other listening disorder. Inform the speaker that you didn't understand. Don't just let it go, because understanding is why you're there. Don't bluff it. Don't assume. Ask questions. I found the most important part of teaching listening was teaching interviewing skills. How to ask questions about what was said so that you really gain an understanding of the topic, not just the words. You don't rely only on the words. Stay close enough that you see the speaker's lips. Choose a location with minimal noise And please make sure the TV and radio are off. And as a warning, protect your hearing, because you only have one. This is the cilia when they're in good shape, they look like a little cowlick, fluid washes over them, creates the neuroelectrical impulses that go to the brain so that we can understand it. Cilia that has been damaged by loud noises don't do very much. Even Brill cream won't help, for those of you old enough to know Brill cream. Most sensory neural hearing loss is caused by noise. Loud traffic, noises, rock concerts, sports events. Our ears can tolerate 85 decibels for 8 hours. Okay, so 8 hours of traffic noise, let's say. The 85 decibels is standing at a corner in general traffic noise. For every 3 dB that noise goes up, the time before damage halves. So sounds of 100 decibels will cause damage in about 15 minutes. At 106 decibels, under 4 minutes. And a rock concert where they really pump the music because they feel that you need to have it loud because we need to feel the music. They pump the music up to about 110 decibels, which creates damage in about 2 minutes. And I've yet to go to a rock concert that lasts for just 2 minutes. I think you'd want your money back. Earplugs, very important. 85 decibels, 8 hours, no problem. 109 decibels, maximum output of an iPod. So if you crank up your iPod, that's what it's going to be, 109 decibels. Chainsaw at 112. Sandblasting or a loud rock concert can be up to 115 decibels. I worked at a community college in Los Angeles for a while, and I went around campus one day, and anybody I saw with earbuds in their ears, I asked them to take the right earbud out and place it on the sound level meter. And after the end of the day, I averaged out the numbers. The numbers were 108 decibels. And the speaker of an earbud is very, very close to the eardrum. So the effect is amplified that much more. So you've got less than 2 minutes that you can listen to it without damage. So if anybody is looking for a new career going out into the coming years, think about hearing aids. Because there's going to be a lot of people that need them. A personal request, and I really believe that this is important and personal, okay? Listening disorders affect a large segment of our population, 50% or more. They have a negative impact on our global economy in the tune of $7 trillion. Yet there is not one formal university program on listening disorders that bring it all together, that bring auditory processing and hearing loss and depression and all of this under one program for somebody to begin to understand like we had today. Listening disorders is multidisciplinary. You've got to learn some audiology, audio engineering, architecture, physics, psychology, cognitive psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, linguistics. This is a big area. And yet no college has even one course that begins to look at it. So my request to my academic colleagues, will one university take the baton and offer a course, maybe one semester for undergrads, maybe 1 year for graduate students? Maybe this could lead to a degree in listening pathology, people that can begin to understand all of the complexities of listening disorders and be able to diagnose and to help people listen more effectively. And if any university is willing to pick up that baton, I'm here to assist you in any way that I can. I'm going to add a special thanks to my friend and colleague, Lee Rubin, who allowed me to use a lot of his cartoons to illustrate this talk. He's an incredible cartoonist, syndicated and published in hundreds of newspapers around the world. Sense of humor that is sick as anybody I know, so it's wonderful. So with this, I thank you for listening.